Bruce, you must have something really good too.
Of course I do. It's Bruce Danielson, and I guess I'm here to entertain you too.
All right, I want to call this audit committee meeting to order, Thursday, August 25th, 2022. We do have a quorum here, and I think just for the benefit of the people on the board, I'd just like to go around here real quick and introduce each of us so that we know who we are and what's going on. So I'll start with you.
Dean Bucknerberg.
Alex Jensen.
Greg Neitzert, City Council.
Tony Gotch.
Rich McCorris.
David Barranco.
Well, thank you very much for all being here today and for you guys for serving on this as non-elected members. We will go to the second order of business, the approval of the minutes of Monday, March 28th, 2022.
So moved, Mr. Chair.
Second.
Thank you very much. We have a motion by Neitzert and a second by Gotch. Let's take a vote.
Committee members Barranco,
Yes.
Bucknerberg,
Yes.
Gotch,
Yes.
Jensen,
Yes.
McCorris,
Yes.
Neitzert.
Yes.
Thank you. We'll move on to the reports and updates. We will start with Emily. If you'd like to come up and address us on intro to audit, audit committee handbook, and kind of go over your work.
All right, good afternoon. I'm Emily Newell, internal auditor. We're going to start with just a few brief slides to give you an overview of what internal audit is in the context of the city. Since we have a few new members, it will obviously be review for the rest of you, but good to brush up on it every once in a while. So, for the purposes of a definition, internal audit is the objective, assurance, independent, and consulting activity designed to add value and improve an organization's operations. So that's within our actual standards for a definition. It can also help an organization accomplish its objectives by bringing a systematic, disciplined approach to evaluating and improving the effectiveness of risk management, control, and governance processes. For the city, the risk management, control, and governance portion of that is most descriptive of what we do. We'll kind of get into how we differ from an external audit on the next page, which I think is a really good overview, especially if you're newer here. So internal auditors, we're really evaluating and recommending ways to improve the effectiveness of the controls and processes, looking at every type of control that would be relevant to the process of the audit plan itself. So sometimes we do performance ones, financial audits, practices, processes, risk that's been identified, but then the external auditors are really going to focus on the financial statements themselves and the accuracy of the reporting on them. So when we're looking at like questions that you might have, those two things can kind of help guide which area we're in there. As far as a history of internal audit, I'm sure you're probably somewhat aware of this, but we go back to 2005. We kind of came out of a bit of a controversy originally with that Phillips to the Falls project with some overspending, and then they went in and did a South Dakota State Department of Legislative Audit that recommended that we establish this committee. So that's where this originally came from. And then it was established in 2006, and the first auditor came in at that time, and now we have an internal audit charter as well, which is now in ordinance. So that kind of takes us up to this point. And then the other critical thing that we do would be looking, oh, we skipped one there? Yeah, there we go. Yeah, you can move on now. So we really want to look at creating a risk-based audit plan each year, which is going to be coming up by the end of the year, and then that will be approved and adopted in December. And that helps us provide independence and objectivity. And those are kind of our two major things that we want to abide by, providing you an independent and objective internal audit activity. And then we can do a wide variety of different types of audits. Assurance ones, which is kind of similar to a compliance one, assuring the processes and the controls that are in place, consulting ones, and those more come from the department itself when they're asking us to come in and provide input, or an operational type one, which an example would be previously we went and looked at the landfill, and that was more of the actual operations that were going on rather than looking at like a specific risk that they had in mind. And then financial, security, privacy, third-party contracting, or environmental. So there are even more than are on those lists, but that gives you quite a few different types that we could do. And then as far as the mission, we aim to help the city achieve the highest efficiency and effectiveness with integrity. And that is also in our charter and in the ordinance. And then a vision to be a highly respected service vision and catalyst for positive change. So that's kind of the general overview and what makes us different in the specific internal audit context of the city. We're going to touch on the actual audit plan itself later at the end, but do you have any questions on the overview?
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. Are there any other questions here? No? One of the questions that I have, if I can just ask one, is for my own knowledge and just, you know, for the committee, they may have a better interpretation of it, but can you talk about some of the internal controls? And maybe not even today, but maybe next, we'll have another meeting here sometime in the next 3 months. Can you bring some of those internal controls and how those are defined? And
Yeah, do you want a couple examples for now, just so you have an idea?
please.
Yeah, so it could be like segregation of duties. So making sure the person who receives the check is not the person who's recording it. So separating like the recording and the accounting and the custodial functions. It could be like a process control so that the person who's like designing a software, they're not also then making maybe like changes to like bank statements sort of thing. So that like when we make new softwares, that should be separated from the functions of the people who are doing, like, you don't want them writing code in that then, you know, you can get around later for money purposes. A lot of them function around those like separating functions. They could be built into like the software themselves. So we want audit trails in place so that we can go backwards and find who went through each step. But yeah, we can definitely even make it longer. It's a very long list of different types of things by the type of activity that you're looking at.
Perfect. And I think for my own benefit and then the committee, but mostly the public, that's just perfect because they want to know that those are in place. And I think you guys have a good start. So thank you for that. If there are no more questions, we will move on to our next item, which Ryan will present to us, and we'll be going over the 340B pharmacy agreement. So thank you for coming up.
Yep.
And start when you're ready.
So I'm Ryan Lossing, also internal auditor. I just wanted to start by thanking you all for coming, taking the time to hear our presentations. So we completed a Lewis Drug 340B pharmacy agreement audit, and our objective here was just to determine if Lewis is compliant with the various requirements of the agreement, especially in regards to patient eligibility status, duplicate discounts, diversion, and insurance coverage. To provide a little bit of background, in 1992, Congress passed Section 340B of the Public Health Service Act, which required pharmaceutical manufacturers to enter into an agreement with the Health and Human Services Secretary. And under this agreement, they agreed to provide discounts on covered outpatient drugs to covered entities that serve the most vulnerable patient populations. Through this agreement or program, covered entities and their patients do realize substantial savings, ranging anywhere from $5 to over $600 per prescription based on the medication provided. And on February 3rd of 2011, Falls Community Health, or FCH, entered into an agreement with Lewis Drug Stores to provide pharmacy services to eligible patients with regards to the 340B outpatient drugs. So FCH providers write the prescriptions, and then the Lewis prescribes those drugs to the patients, among other pharmacy services required. And before I get into the findings and recommendations, I just want to preface by saying that while all requirements are important, the two biggest concerns and requirements of the 340B program are preventing diversion and duplicate discounts. And diversion occurs when 340B drugs are provided to non-eligible patients or patients who aren't part of FCH and an FCH patient. And then duplicate discounts happen when 340B drugs are prescribed and dispensed to patients who have Medicaid eligibility, and then those drugs are subsequently billed to Medicaid, resulting in the duplicate discount. So those are really the two main things we're wanting to avoid when looking through this audit. So with that, we'll get into some of the findings here. Finding one, we found that Lewis doesn't really implement any sort of inventory optimization processes, which does make it a little more difficult to ensure that they have sufficient levels of inventory for their patients. And so we recommended that FCH work with Lewis and utilize their pharmacy software, Pioneer RX, to establish a more efficient inventory optimization process. And then we also recommend FCH to develop a process for setting those kind of minimum maximum levels of letting Lewis know when they should be reordering inventory, and also for completing a physical inventory review at least annually. Finding two up here, we found that Lewis doesn't really utilize a tracking system to retrospectively review dispensing reports and verify patient eligibility, which is a requirement of the agreement. And so to alleviate that, we recommended that FCH and Lewis work together to develop this tracking system that Lewis will utilize to prevent the diversion of drugs to uneligible patients. And then we also recommend FCH to make periodic checks to make sure this tracking system is in place and working properly. Finding three, in testing, we pulled a sample of prescription forms and tested all of the requirements on them. And we found that 20% of those prescriptions did not have a designation that the 340B, that the patient was eligible for 340B drugs, which is also another requirement in the agreement. So we just recommended that FCH look at their eClinicalWorks, which is their electronic health record software, and add that functionality that allows maybe a checkbox or something to allow providers to indicate that these drugs are for, or this prescription is for 340B drugs and that the patient is eligible. Finding four, we found that Lewis was not currently providing all of the required quarterly reports listed in the agreement, and they're down below in recommendation 4, the specific reports. So to be in compliance with the agreement, we recommend that Lewis start providing those following quarterly reports: the financial statements, detailed status report of collections, and a summary of receiving and dispensing records. And then for our opportunities of improvement down here below, our second one actually kind of ties into finding 4 and recommendation 4. We recommend that FCH review the agreement and update any sections, specifically looking at that quarterly report section, to see what is actual practice and what's actually required. The Federal Register notice of the 340B program kind of provided some examples of quarterly reports, just as customary business reports that are normally produced. And so they provided these 3 reports as options or examples of reports, but not necessarily as requirements. So we just recommend the FCH kind of review and make sure what is required is actually listed out in the agreement and that it's all correct. And then finally, we had one other opportunity for improvement. Is the first bullet up there. We recommend that FCH update their e-prescription form to list out Falls Community Health, as this is another requirement in the agreement. Currently, they have the address of Falls Community Health on there, so that's what Lewis kind of uses. When they see the address, they know that the prescription form is from Falls Community Health, but the agreement does say that the form should list Falls Community Health, so we recommend just to simply add right above the address there, Falls Community Health, to be in compliance. And to conclude, we're happy to report that management is in agreement with all the recommendations we made, and they have developed action plans to alleviate the findings and satisfy the recommendations. Any questions from you guys?
Well, thank you very much. Mr. Buchnenberg.
So, Ryan, this is really an important program, and all of the areas that you've highlighted, the findings, I'm sure are important, but the items, the more important ones like diversion or duplicate billing,
Yep.
you didn't find any.
Did not find any of those. So they are sticking to that they're not diverting drugs to ineligible patients or double billing to 340B and Medicaid.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Counselor Neitzer.
Oh, thank you. So following up on what Dean said, in your finding about, you had noted the 20%.
Yep.
Was that just a matter that you don't believe that people that were not qualified were getting the discount, but just that it wasn't documented?
They were all
correctly?
eligible patients. It's just that the prescription form didn't list that they were eligible. We went and looked in FCH's electronic health record to make sure that they were active patients and were seeing a provider, and they all were. It's just that what practice is that providers write in the comment section 340B or something like that. So there isn't a place for them to designate 340B. They're just adding it as a comment, and in 20% of them, it got missed. So that's why the recommendation is to add that functionality, to add like a checkbox that this is hey, this is for 340B. And we also recommended that they added to their annual provider training all the prescription form requirements so that all the providers are aware of everything that needs to be added for those 340B prescriptions.
Okay, very good, thank you.
Counselor Bronco.
Just, you went a little fast for me there. So all of these recommendations and all of these findings have been presented to Lewis Management. And they accepted these findings and are willing to take the actions that are recommended?
We provided them to the health department management, and they have accepted and are working with Lewis
I see.
on the recommendations. Yeah.
Okay.
Are there any other questions? Maybe I'll just end with one question. So with the recommendations and your follow-up, so that will be a follow-up in future meetings that we'll have. Is that accurate?
That's correct.
That's awesome. Thank you very much for that. Thank you for your report. We're going to need to take some action on this. So, Counselor Neitzer.
If I remember what we need to take action on.
We need a motion to submit the report to the city council.
Thank you. I will move to submit the report to the city council.
I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion. Let's take a vote. City clerk.
Committee members Barranco,
Yes.
Bucknerberg,
Yes.
Gotch,
Yes.
Jensen,
Yes.
McCoris,
Yes.
Neitzer.
Yes.
All right. We will now move on to the damage recovery billing. Emily, when you're ready, please address us.
Hello. So the next audit we have is the damage recovery billing process. I'll start with a little bit of a background before I go into the objective, just so that you understand what this is. So at the most basic level, if I was driving down Minnesota and I hit a stop sign, we need to pay for that to be replaced and taken care of. So this is the process that we find the person responsible, usually a police report. It's then translated usually into a work order if the city is the one who's going to be fixing it, or there's a vendor maybe who has to come by and fix it. We then take the actual costs incurred, and then the city bills the individual who is responsible for that. And so this was an audit of that process from the beginning to the end of how, from an objective, we were looking at assessing the effectiveness and efficiency of the damage billing recovery process to ensure the city is recovering labor and material costs to repair damages to the city assets. So it could be any city asset. We did exclude the fleet from this specific audit just because that's a very large section that would be treated separately in its own audit at some point. So this is more property-related ones rather than vehicles. From a background perspective, the city as a self-insured entity seeks reimbursement for property damages losses from third parties. Recovery of losses to repair or replace, that would include the materials and the labor, that directly impacts our city revenue and expense budgets. That's kind of why this is an important area. The pursuit of the recovery against those third parties responsible for damaging city assets is decentralized. It doesn't fit entirely under any one department, not risk management. Risk management does a good job of the kind of the initial parts of the process. They are involved in the notification that something has been hit. Then as far as the actual billing, that's done from the department that the asset was hit, so whether that's the Parks Department or a large quantity of these we found were under highways and streets or lights. Those are things on the side of the road that get hit most frequently. And then the city attorney's office is involved when it goes to small claims court. Finance is in charge for the overall billing policy. And then the actual like collections, if it were to go to AAA, is what we use for collections there. Departments that incur the expense to repair or damaged property and assets, so it's usually within their budget, it's at that department itself. And then that property damage recovery claims are usually the result of a vehicle accident. And so I listed some of the most common ones: streetlights, stop signs, fire hydrants, very common, as well as electric boxes and electric poles. And then there is a little bit of information for the number of damages. So in 2020, they billed for $217,806 of damages to city property. Again, that's excluding the fleet. And then $159,376 was collected in revenue from those types of claims. That there is an offset period between when we bill and we actually get that money. So it's not, we weren't necessarily collecting on, apples to apples, like the tree was hit in 2020 and then we got that money in 2020, but just to give you a general idea of how much we're billing and then collecting in a year. So what we found, our first finding, materials that were invoiced with an overhead charge in one city department. So essentially an overhead was being charged for just that one department rather than just doing the flat actuals, whereas the other departments, it was the standard process just to do actuals. For one department, there was also an estimated labor rate that was used, whereas the other departments were using actual labor. So just more of a standardization of the process finding. And then also billing for damages to city property claims were not formally documented in a procedure to oversee the process as a whole because of that decentralized nature. And then for our recommendations, we recommend that each department responsible for processing damage recovery claims establish a formalized administrative procedure for property damage recovery claims specific to the software utilized. That's most commonly the ViewWorks that manages the work order system that is kind of the origin point for these processes, because that's collecting the labor and the actual materials when we as a city are going out to fix whatever it was that was hit. So it's looking at recommending a procedure that's specific to that ViewWorks, if that's what most of them are using. Well, that kind of covers the most of that first recommendation of getting a centralized policy. The second recommendation is we recommend finance establish a monitoring program to ensure that each department procedures are in place and that appropriately implement the billing for the damage to city property policy. So since that overall policy regarding the billing is under the realm of finance, it was a recommendation to have them a monitoring system in place for that. And then the third recommendation, we recommend all department procedures for damage billing require supporting documentation be stored electronically in the software available to the department. That was being done in all except for one, and they were being stored in paper form, but since they're moving towards a centralized asset ViewWorks software that has that capability to store everything, we'd like to just see that also electronically in there. But it wasn't that anything was missing. So then for opportunities, we had 2 opportunities for improvement for this one. We recommended a formalized procedure to aid the departments in decision-making, including exact thresholds for write-offs. So there's some general guidance, but wanted to see a more standardized procedure for specifically when they're going to initiate a write-off. And then we also recommend that ViewWorks, which is being utilized for work order management capabilities, be implemented in each department and really maximize the efficiency of that software that's already in some of them as it spreads across the city, which I think is the plan. They're continuing to implement it. So I think that's it for our findings and recommendations on damage recovery billing. I did want to thank, this was, that involved multiple different departments, so we had a lot of cooperation from finance, also city attorney's office, risk management, and public works. They were all very helpful.
Well, thank you for your report. Are there any questions? Counselor Neitzer?
Well, first, I want to compliment both Emily and Ryan on very good presentations and adding color to it. And because having been on the audit committee for a long time, there have been times where people literally just read back to us the report. And so it's helpful to have more color commentary, as it were. So thank you for that. So do you have an idea of maybe just in the sampling period that you did, what the average loss was to us?
I don't have it in front of me now. Overall, they were small. So at a certain dollar amount threshold, they are able, I think it's $10,000, they're able to pursue, it won't fit in small claims court, but and it can actually go up to the next level. And there, I think, in my sample period, there weren't any. And the majority of them were considerably smaller. So there was a couple that were maybe pulling the average up higher, but the vast majority were $5,000 or less. Yeah.
Are a lot of these the sort of thing where somebody may have some sort of, let's say, vehicle insurance, and then we just do subrogation and we go over to their insurance company and we end up collecting through there?
When they have insurance, yep, that is a first start area. There are some, though, that they didn't have insurance or that they would have a difficult time locating the person, especially if they didn't have insurance. It was even more difficult, I think, for them to then locate who it was. But yes, because a lot of them are vehicle related, they do start with insurance.
You just have like a, if I could.
Yes.
If you have like a hit and run or something and you can't find them, the department just have to just fix it and it's just a loss on their budget?
Yeah. If they eventually are able to, if there's a police report later on, but it does really start with that police report initially.
Okay, and then finally, I don't know if you know this, but do you know if there's I think you mentioned that essentially it's the department who is, so if a fire hydrant gets hit, the fire department, it's their loss, and then they got to replace it, and then they might recover later. Do you know if there's potentially a threshold, like if somebody drives into one of a city building and it's a $3 million parks building and it burns down, if it comes out of the park budget, if we have some sort of casualty fund?
That might be a finance question. I'm not sure of any of them. That seemed, yeah.
It's a bit of an
If
outlier.
you run into a
maybe.
building, there would be a considerably higher amount, yeah.
And maybe our insurance coverage would potentially kick in. But, okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions? Council McCurris?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're just following up on recommendation 2 here about the monitoring program.
Yes.
So I'm just example that you use, they hit a tree, submit the invoice, send the invoice to the person about the tree. 30 days later, they still haven't collected. Is the finance department then reaching back out to the Parks and Rec saying, hey, nobody's paid this invoice yet? And then someone in the Parks Department is becoming a collector?
So the Munis software that we use for financials across the entire city automatically creates statements every 30, 60, 90 days. And so for the majority of departments, it is somewhat decentralized, but that's created, automatically generated, and then it is sent to the individual responsible for billing at the department level, like let's say if it's in parks or whatnot, and then a few of them are centralized within finance, but otherwise, yes, they attempt to contact them and then get payment. Otherwise, there are instances when it's sent to collections, or if the city attorney's office is involved and it's maybe going to small claims court, then it would be kind of removed from the department and it would move over to that area instead. But yeah, the statement is automatically generated and then decentralized and sent out to attempt to contact the person or the insurance. Or
Can you give us the 30-second commercial on why there wasn't a recommendation for centralizing it, that the finance department does the follow-up, et cetera?
to have the actual finance department being the one set it out. So part of the reason why it's decentralized in the contacting portion of it is that each department is kind of responsible because they're the ones who are collecting the information from like the police department or et cetera. So they have that contact information. And so like the police report is within, when I was talking about the asset works, it's included in there. And so they have all of that documentation within there. But it is certainly possible that it could go the other route and it could all be or centralized within risk management as well. It's kind of oriented that way now because of how the work orders and how the fixing of the repair is being done.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? I just have one, Emily, and I think I might have missed it, so sorry about that. What was the management's response?
So we actually have already just today completed the follow-up audit for this one as well, which will be on the next audit committee meeting. So all of these, management concurred with and was in the process of implementing. I believe they were all fully implemented as of today with the exception of 2 of them that were like in progress. So they had all been started and the majority were already actually implemented. So this one's pretty well wrapped up.
Outstanding. Thank you for that, Emily. I would look for a motion to submit this report to the city council.
So moved. Nicer.
Second?
All right, city clerk, can we have a vote?
Committee members Baranco,
Yes.
Bucknerberg,
Yes.
Gotch,
Yes.
Jensen.
Yes.
McCoris,
Yes.
Nitzer.
Yes.
Okay, we will send that on. We'll go to our next agenda item, which is D. We'll go Midco cash handling follow-up. Ryan, please step up and present when you are ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is going to be a follow-up that we performed on the cash handling audit, which the report was issued in July of 2021. And so really our objective here is just to assess the status of audit recommendations and management action plans previously noted in the Midco cash handling audit. So a bit of follow-up methodology. Really all we're doing is reviewing over the recommendations, the management responses, and then we're confirming the current status of management operations and then determining whether they satisfy those recommendations and responses by management. So we'll go through what we recommended. Recommendation 1 was that we recommended that Midco staff establish a process to monitor their compliance with the deposit procedure and the billing cash receipts and collections policy to ensure existing procedures are being followed, segregation of duties is maintained, and proper documentation is retained. And this recommendation really stemmed from the finding that managers or the head guard weren't filling out deposit slips. They were being filled out by the cashiers who are taking in the cash. And so our recommendation was kind of split that up, with segregation of duties. It shouldn't be the same person filling out the deposit slips as who are accepting the cash. And so the response was that pool managers will oversee the counting of cash drawers and provide a second count. And they will also complete the daily bank deposit slip and include date, location, as well as employee city ID number. And they will document this in their manager employee handbook. And the status, as of today, has been implemented. We went and took a judgmental sample from July of 2022 of deposits and reviewed about 20 of them, and all of them had been filled out by the acting pool manager on duty at the time. For recommendation 2, we just recommended an increase in controls in RecTrack, which is their point of sale software that they use at the pool. We wanted to limit access to process refunds to remove that from cashiers and from finance. And then we also recommended that access to enter transactions should be removed from finance users. And we just kind of added that if access can't be removed for whatever reason, we recommend that reports of these transactions be ran and reviewed by the appropriate parties. So I'm not going to read through all of management's response, but basically they said that their RecTrack software lead and IT were going to work with the different users, go out and talk to them about their roles and responsibilities and see if this access can be viably removed. And then all corrective action would be in place by August of 2021. So our status here is it was implemented. They did not remove the access because there were just a few with the cashier specifically. In order to keep a high level of customer service, they really needed to be able to process, they only process credit card transaction or credit card refunds, not cash refunds. So it's only when it's paid with a credit card, they can process those refunds back to the customer's credit card. But it's practice that they'll get the manager, to say, hey, I'm doing this refund to kind of approve it. But really to keep that high level of customer service, they have decided to keep that access with the cashiers. And then also, the finance users, they sometimes have to enter transactions into the system if they get a bank statement. So they're not actually receiving the money. They're just getting a bank statement that money was deposited into the account. And so they need to make that related transaction into RecTrack. So it really is more of a reconciliation procedure rather than them receiving the money, entering the transaction, and then going and performing the reconciliation after. It is really more of a reconciliation process that they're doing. But they have created automated reports of both refunds and transactions produced by finance users, and those are automated and sent out to the appropriate parties for review. Our recommendation 3 here, it was that we recommended 4 additional steps to take to increase cash security at the Midco Aquatic Center. Those 4 are listed there, locking their cash registers and connecting them to RecTrack so that whenever a system is, or a transaction is processed, it will just automatically open the locked drawer for access. We recommended a lock and badge reader be installed to the door to access the cashier's area so that unauthorized access people wouldn't be able to get in there who aren't authorized. We recommended cash counts be performed away from the front desk, out of the view of customers and other employees. And then we recommended that the safe's code lock be changed on a regular basis. So management response was that they were going to look into all 4 of those things and try to get them implemented. And the current status of the recommendation is in progress. They did install a badge reader and lock on the door, and that was locked. And then I did observe cash counts being performed in the manager's office away from the front desk. Currently, the Parks and Rec have received a quote from a vendor for secured cash drawers, and they need to determine if they're viable and worth the cost. And then the changing of the safe, in talking to some of the cashiers during the follow-up, they weren't aware of when it was changed last. So now the actual changing of the safe code has been assigned to a recreation program specialist, and they added it as a to-do when each activity guide is sent out, which they send out quarterly. So that would be in line with the recommendation. Recommendation 4 here, we just simply recommended that whoever's filling out the deposit slip, so the manager or head guard, should be using their city-assigned C number, as this is easier to read and signatures can be kind of messy, so you can't really tell who's filling them out. But with that C number, it's going to be a lot more easier to identify who is filling out the deposit slip. So they responded they were going to start having their pool managers filling out with the city-assigned C number. And once again, during our follow-up, I looked at 20 deposit slips, and all 20 had the C number, so that one has been successfully implemented. We have 2 opportunity for improvements here. The first one here was that we recommended that they start scanning and electronically sending all documentation to finance to reduce paper costs, mail carrier costs. And so their response was that they were going to look into start scanning everything, look at it for 30 days and see if it's still viable to continue. So this status is currently still in progress. They do scan and electronically send documentation daily, but signed receipts, deposit slips, and other reports are still sent through interoffice mail. However, they're sent weekly rather than daily, so this does cut down on some mail costs, doing that weekly rather than daily. And then in addition, finance is no longer going to require signatures for credit card transactions beginning September of this year. So that should allow Midco to eliminate interoffice mail altogether, since they won't have to send those hard copy of the signed receipts over to finance anymore. Finally, for our second opportunity for improvement, we recommended finance to update the credit card signature section of their billing, cash receipts, and collections policy to define thresholds that each department or system should follow. And so typically they had different thresholds for either the landfill, parks. They all had different thresholds for when a signed receipt was required. So we just wanted to recommend to put those in the policy to increase transparency so every department knows what their threshold is. And the status is this recommendation is no longer applicable since, as we just mentioned, finance is no longer going to require credit card signatures. So that's going to be removed. So as you can see here on the report, most of the action plans have been successfully implemented, with the exception of a couple that are currently in progress.
Well, thank you very much for your follow-up on this. Are there any questions? Mr. Gotch?
Yeah, for the ones that are still in progress, do you continue to go back and follow up until they're?
Yep, we're gonna, so we have them, we all have in our audit board system, they are called issues. So we have an issue for each one of these findings and recommendations and opportunities. So the ones that have been implemented, we will close out. And then the ones that are not, we're gonna keep open so that we know we need to go back and check it one more time. And we're probably not gonna report, if we go back and look and they are implemented, we're not gonna do another report just for those two. We're just gonna, it's only if there's an issue, we will come back and report that to you guys.
Are there any other questions? Great work, Ryan. Thank you very much. There's no action needed on this, so thank you for your report. We'll go to item E, bid tax follow-up. Emily? When you are ready, go ahead.
Right. Thank you. So our next one is another follow-up. This is looking at the bid tax original audit that was completed. It had kind of 3 different objectives that they looked at: determining if adequate controls were in place to ensure the accuracy of the bid tax collection and remittance processes from the hotels and the business improvement district, which is what bid tax stands for. Then we also evaluated the city of Sioux Falls bid tax collection and remittance processes and determined if adequate controls are in place to ensure expenditures of bid tax revenue are appropriate and align with the purpose of the bid tax. The follow-up methodology for this one kind of took 2 general categories. Some of the recommendations were surrounding updates to an ordinance or a policy, and so those were reviewed for language and the specific recommendations. And then the other area of follow-up was sampling and looking at some of the actual supporting documentation that was submitted with those to make sure that it include things like detailed instructions, a signed sworn statement, and those are things that were required. So there was some detailed testing that was done to look at actual supporting documentation as well. So what we recommended, the first one was to review and update the City of Sioux Falls Code of Ordinances, Chapter 37, Taxation related to bid tax, to accurately reflect the Convention and Visitors Bureau name change, that change to Experience Sioux Falls, as well as to remove the inaccurate hotel listing that was listed. It was just an out-of-date listing that was in there. And so that didn't need to be in there any longer. And so management had responded that they were planning to do both of those things. And just recently here in the last couple of months, this ordinance was updated and that listing of hotels was just removed rather than keeping one in there that had to constantly be changed. That was taken out. For recommendation number 2, to enforce ordinance 37-196 and require a signed sworn statement be submitted with each bid tax payment remitted to the city by hotels and the business improvement district. In addition, the documentation should be filed in the city's financial system to be available and accessed at any time. And so management had responded that they were going to update the forms and actually combined 2 different ones that were previously being used into one more user-friendly and detailed one. And that has been completed, it's implemented, and it's in use now. The other recommendation, number 3, was regarding that tax worksheet, which was one of the several forms that was used previously. Needed to be recommended that we update it with specific and detailed instructions on how the entire form was to be filled out. There was maybe some consistency and accuracy before that we thought could be addressed by a more detailed instructions portion on the form, and that was updated to have a more streamlined instructions that included how to fill out each different portion of the form. And so that has also been implemented and is in use now. Then recommendation number 4, that was the last recommendation, that was regarding finance policies and procedures. We recommended that management document and establish a written policy and procedure that addresses how to handle potential inaccurate bid tax payments that are remitted to the city by hotels. And then update the policy and procedure regarding performing audits so that the wording complies with III standards. So essentially, the wording previously made it sound like internal audit was responsible for like managing, and it was not accurately describing what needed to be in place. And so it has now since been adjusted and removed that language that was referencing that internal audit would be assisting with the auditing of the hotels. Instead, management will perform such audits administratively. It made it sound like we were going to be going in and doing that, whether it's more meant as like a monitoring, finance will be monitoring that. So that's more clearly in their policy now. So that status is also implemented. And then there was one opportunity. We recommended that management establish, document, and implement a standardized automated customer remittance and collection process. Management had responded that they were going to review that and look at potential ones to get implemented, and it's currently in the verification and testing process of a viable software solution. So it's not currently in process yet, but they are testing an option.
Well, thank you for your follow-up, Emily. We appreciate that. Mr. Buchnenberg.
Thank you. Thanks for your work, Emily. Just for my own information, we say management here. We're talking about the finance department in this case?
Yes.
Okay. And then, do you know, just out of curiosity, does the finance department do any testing of these reports that come in from the hotels? Do they go out and compare the revenue information with the hotel's records on a test basis ever?
I am not aware of any. I don't know if there's a finance individual who would be able to better answer that. I'm not aware that they physically go and compare those, but I could certainly ask and inquire and find out more.
It just seems like it would be a prudent thing for the city to do, at least on a test basis, just to.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if there is any other like separate auditing that occurs of that from the bid tax perspective. So, yep, that we could definitely do some more research there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? All right. Well, thank you for your follow-up. There is no action needed here on item E. So we'll move on. Emily, you're up again. Travel expenditures, follow-up.
Yes. This is my last one for you now, finally. I'm near the end. Thank you for sticking with us so far. So this last one is a follow-up to the travel expenditures audit that we had completed previously. It's looking specifically at expenses that are incurred when you're traveling as an employee of the city. And so it's not related to something that you maybe need to purchase if you're not in travel status. That's a separate thing we're going to be looking at a future date, but specifically it would be flights, hotels, meals, that sort of thing. And so the objective was to assess the status of the management's action plans for the recommendations that we had previously noted in this report that was issued June 2021. We did several different things as far as looking at some follow-up methodology. There were recommendations that we made specific to the language of their policy, so we reviewed those updates and that they had been implemented and provided to staff. And then we also did some testing of specific travel claims to follow up. The initial testing was done on travel expense claims to see if they were accurate and had all the supporting documentation. And so then we went back again to check on those, and they were all processed according to policy and procedure in our testing follow-up sample. So that was a positive there. And then finally, we also did some looking at non-travel. It was a recommendation that that's going to be audited in the future. And so you'll see on here, we recommended a separate policy be written. And so it's marked as in status, in progress on this report. we are going to be looking at that. It was in draft form and it will be audited by the end of this year. So that's kind of another highlight from this. Other than that, though, we had several recommendations, like recommendation 1, that management create a final review step by an individual other than the travel coordinator processing the claim, and that was a segregation of duties related thing, just to get a second set of eyes on there. They had responded that they were going to implement a few different things related to that, making sure that when there's a lead travel coordinator, not that exact name, but that when that individual is entering a claim, that they are reviewed by somebody different from her, and that there's also a sample of claims that are going to be reviewed every month. They're going to select 5 of them to review. So they took our response and then made some specific management actions that have been implemented since then, and we did follow up and check that those had been done. We also recommended that they provide a refresher training annually, which they did complete last fall, and also to any new ones that might start moving forward, since there were some changes to the policy and procedure just to make sure that they're communicated to the people who are actually processing these claims. And then for recommendation number 3, we recommended creating a separate policy. That was the one we were talking about for non-travel status. So that's in progress and going to be audited here soon. This one had quite a few, but we'll just kind of summarize them for you. Recommendation number 4 was related to the language of the policy. We just wanted to see that they explicitly stated that expenses on a personal card or city card required an itemized receipt. And so they did add that language. And it was being done the vast majority of the time, but just to make sure that it was a requirement that then they could point back to, yes, we need this to reimburse you, so that you can tell exactly what was being purchased and when. And that has been added and implemented. Similar to that, recommendation number 5 is also in regard to the form that they fill out, adding a specific signature that says submitted to travel coordinator date. They need to be able to keep track of how long you have from when you travel to when you're submitting and getting paid. And to really make sure that that's happening, you need a date that it was submitted to track to. So we just wanted to see that specific date added on there. Then number 6, we recommend the individual post the AP batch, and that's in the financial software, be a different individual than the person processing and entering the expense claim. The only instance that it might have been the same was when that, call it lead travel coordinator, was processing it, and they just formalized in their procedure that someone else needs to review those. So that's been taken care of. And then we just had a couple of opportunities on the end there. We recommended amending the current travel request form to include a signature and submitted date by the traveler or travel coordinator, similar to one above. That's for record-keeping purposes as well, so that they can keep track of the timeline that's required per the policy. And they had already made that change, and that's on the form that's being used currently. We also recommended for an opportunity to ensure accuracy and reasonability in line with best practices, amending the city travel process policy to also require an online map screenshot or some other amounts to compare to the odometer readings. Previously, it was just an odometer reading. So the one standard would be to use a map of where you went. And for this purposes, they're actually working on using personal mileage tracking within the Concur software that they've already used. And so that one's marked as partially implemented, but they have already pilot tested it in some departments. So it's in its way moving out. Then our last recommendation for an opportunity was to amend the city policy regarding luggage. So it had currently said that they were only allowed to have one that was going to be paid on a flight. And there are quite a few instances where specifically fire would need to fly to go to a training or something like that, and they have to bring their gear with them. And so technically, per the policy, that second bag, which was their gear that was needed for their job, wouldn't have been allowed, but it is a needed work expense. So we just wanted to see that the policy would be amended to allow for that, because it's something that's required for them to do their job. And it's already been updated and implemented, so taken care of. That's all I have for this one.
Great work, Emily. Thank you very much. Are there any questions? Counselor Neitzer?
Emily, this isn't directly on point to the recommendation, so if you can't remember, it's not a big deal, but do you know if the city travel policy has a rule in terms of what class you can fly? Like, you have to do coach, that you can't do first class or anything, or?
So it's actually booked by someone in finance. You're not booking it yourself. And it does say something along the lines of like the most economical. So
Okay.
no, I don't know that it specifically says no, not first class. I guess in the crazy instance that it was on like, I don't know, super sale or something. But there is reasonability built in there.
They're
And
supposed
it's-
to be looking for the best cost, essentially.
Yes, exactly. And you're not booking it for yourself. And so that extra check is in there as well.
Do we have a policy regarding whether you're supposed to take a fleet vehicle versus taking your own vehicle?
So there is information on the mileage reimbursement portion in there. We don't really have very many fleet vehicles. And so I don't believe there's specific language that says, no, you need to be taking this over it, because we don't have very many to do that with. So it's more aimed at reimbursing you for your private one.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay, are there any other questions? Okay, seeing none. Thank you, Emily. We'll move on to our last agenda item under 3, reports and updates, and we will talk about the audit plan update. Oh, please, step on up.
Sorry, Cody Papke, Chief Accountant, Finance. I wanted to address first the mileage question. Typically, that is a department-by-department decision, but if you are doing direct business with the city and a fleet car is available, we default to the fleet vehicles first before personal vehicles. So I just wanted to address that. And then I also wanted to address your question in regards to the audit of the bid tax. We actually do 5 bid tax audits a year. They are random. Unless you're consistently late, then you go to the top of the list for an audit. So we do audits. Like I said, typically you're selected randomly, but if you are consistently late, you will go to the top of the list. So I just wanted to address those 2 questions a little bit.
Well, thanks,
further.
Cody.
So sorry for my delay on that. I was getting all the details while you were asking it. So sorry about that.
No, that's great. Thank you. I appreciate you stepping up. So thank you. All right, Ryan. Let's hear the audit plan update, and then we'll move on from there. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we've got the last item here for you guys. Just wanted to run through our 2022 audit plan, give you a little highlights over it and where we're at and where we're going with it. So this is the 2022 audit plan that was approved by the City Council on December 21st of 2021. And I'm going to start at the bottom on the carryover audits. So the pharmacy 340B and the damage billing audits, you just heard from us, we just presented today. The ASM Global audit the testing is completed. We just need to write the report, and that should be ready to present here at the next audit committee meeting scheduled, when we schedule that. Going up to the analysis and follow-up audits. The risk analysis is something we do annually, where we go around and assess the risk in each department, meet with management and discuss risks with them. And we kind of use this to help develop our annual audit plan. And so this process is going to start here in September, and by December we will have a 2023 audit plan ready to present to you guys. Above that is our couple consulting audits. Our fraud task force is really something that is ongoing throughout the year. We have a fraud hotline implemented where employees can put in fraud tips to kind of, if they have any idea of things going on, they can put in anonymous tips that then come to us, so then we can investigate further. And then we also advise management on fraud awareness during each individual audit engagement. And then follow-up audits, we did the first 3, we did present here today. And then the Spectra follow-up is about halfway completed, and that one will also be ready here by the next audit committee meeting. Going up then finally to the bunch of assurance audits, we'll go down that list. The facility security audit, we've determined that due to this extensive scope, and go into all the different facilities to do the audit. We will be carrying that one over to the 2023 audit plan to be completed sometime in 2023. The Gulf Management Agreement, the testing is complete, and the first draft of the report has been written. And so that one will also be ready to be presented here at the next audit committee meeting. Cash handling for planning and development. This one has just been getting started. It's in the planning phase, but it will be completed by the end of the year and ready to present by the end of 2022. Cash handling for utility billing. This audit is complete and the report is written and it's ready to be presented at our next committee meeting. Vendor setup and maintenance. We just begun initial planning on this one, kind of looking at previous audits in the area, similar audits conducted by other organizations and best practices. But this audit will be completed and ready to present by the end of 2022. The bidding selection process for engineering services. Planning will begin by the end of this year, and we should have the audit ready to present, potentially carried over to the first committee meeting of 2023 and present then. Reconciliation of AR systems. This one's kind of similar to the facility security. We've determined due to the extensive scope, this one will be carried over to be completed in 2023. And then finally, the employee reimbursements for non-travel. As she kind of mentioned earlier, this one will be started after the planning and development cash handling audit. So starting planning and testing maybe in later fall 2022, and then maybe finished by the end of 2022, but if not, ready for that first committee meeting in 2023. Any questions on that from you guys?
Thank you. Are there any questions? Counselor McCurris.
Thank you, Chair. I don't know if this is a question for you as the chair or the staff, so
Go ahead.
correct me where appropriate or not, but was there a need here at all for this committee to recommend to the council external audit services for one or two of these to not push on to the next year, or how do we handle that? And they're doing really good work here, and so I want to keep them doing the good work, et cetera.
I can start that question, and we've had this discussion between Ryan, Emily, and then Jim and I. So if that was something that the board would kind of recommend, I would tell you that at this time, what they presented was what, kind of came of that. But if we want to, accomplish those, we can address that and we can talk with our experts to see where that may go. Go ahead, Emily.
Regarding like the timing portion of that, if we were to outsource or find an external auditor, it also is very likely that it still wouldn't be completed within this audit plan, so you most likely would still end up with it on the next year as well, just looking at that it's September nearly now. So that was also a consideration.
Can I follow up?
Yep, follow up.
As you look at these that are remaining for this year and that might get pushed out, are there any of these that you kind of look at and say, hey, it would be really helpful? This is kind of an area of really specialized work where it would be good to have an outside. So for example, I look at the bidding selection process for architectural engineering services. That's a big deal, and we do a lot of that in our community. Do you look at that one potentially as something, or do you feel like, no, we want to handle that internally?
Yeah, potentially in that one. And another one that comes to my mind is the reconciliation of AR systems, because that's really technology focused. So really getting that person with an IT audit experience would definitely be beneficial.
Thank you.
Mr. Buckenberg.
My question is, since we've lost a third of our internal audit staff, do you feel like you're overwhelmed in completing this plan and giving each of these audits their due attention?
If we were going to try to get this whole audit plan and include those two that we're going to carry forward, if we were to try to include them by the end of this year, then yes, we would be very overwhelmed with those. So that's why we decided to choose those two to carry over to next year.
And if we don't, if for some reason we don't or can't add an additional internal audit person, even into next year, do you feel like you're going to be able to?
It might affect the plan a little bit, yeah.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any, Counselor Neitzer?
Did you specifically mention, maybe I missed it, the status of whether you were going to move forward with the one that's called construction project?
Oh, sorry, yes. Sir, the city is currently hiring an engineering project manager. So we're gonna, we'll consider that for inclusion on the 2023 plan once that position is hired and a project is created or selected, an engineering project.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Well, thank you for giving us an update. I really appreciate that, Ryan. And if we do have questions, we'll reach out to you guys for sure. So number 4, we're going to go to committee member remarks. And I'm going to start this one off. Emily, could you hop up in front of us, please? Emily has a distinction, a designation now that's conferred by the Institute of Internal Auditors. She has just passed her 3rd exam and is now CIA certified, a certified internal auditor. So I just want to congratulate you. No one can take that away from you. You did the work. There's no one else that did it, and you get to carry that along with you for a while. So we really appreciate your hard work and congratulations. So Ryan just passed his 2nd exam. He has 1 more to go, the 3rd one, and he will be working that over time. As we have a very busy schedule, he has made some determinations on when he wants to do that. So congratulations on the 2nd one, and keep up the strong work on performing these audits and getting them presented to us. The second thing I'll bring up, and then we can go to other committee remarks, is a survey will be sent out to us to talk about our next committee meeting, which will be in October. It'll either be before pheasant season opener or after pheasant season opener. So we'll get that out, and Jim will likely be sending that out, so please look for that. Are there any other committee member remarks? McCurris.
Mr. Chairman, two items. Again, I don't know if they're appropriate here or not. One is just trying to understand the rookie process for the development of the audit plan for 2023. I understood they were meeting with the directors on one of these items here to talk about the risk areas in regards if there's something we see or identify in the city as a whole. Do we recommend that's one of them, or to the chair? How's that work?
Emily, could you please address this?
Yes, so we have a formalized process now that is incorporated through our new audit board software that will really streamline it. So we started it last year, and so this year we'll just be initiating that same thing moving forward. And so what it is a lengthy, I think it's 27 question survey to establish a baseline that all of the city departments will receive, as well as all of you, so that you can fill that out and provide your feedback in there. And so then we take that and it gets benchmarked and compared to the previous year, all of that information, and then that becomes our risk-based audit plan. So we evaluate the different types of risks. So there's quite a few different categories that they're all ranked, and so you will also be involved in that survey. So you have an opportunity.
Can I add on to that? For an example, like during this process, one of the, things that I'm gonna recommend to our auditors to take a look at would be following up on the Sioux Falls for All plan, because we expended a lot of dollars during that time. So I will put that into their system, as you can put in, as Councilor Neitzer a year or two ago put in the bidding selection process of architectural and engineering services. So that's one component from us. The other component would be from from what she just discussed. So I just wanted to highlight that, but go ahead with your second question unless you have a follow-up.
No, that's really helpful. I just appreciate, sorry to take people's time with understanding that, but.
The survey will also be really detailed to the departments, but I think it's useful for you all to see it. You obviously won't be able to answer all of the questions. They won't be relative, but then you'll have an idea of what's being solicited from the individual departments. And there's definitely space in there for other comments, whatever it is that you want to make sure we know.
That's helpful. Second comment was more of a specific, just because it's happening right now, and I know that our workload is really big right now, but the Multicultural Center's been a big part of Sioux Falls. It's been a collaborative effort between the city of Sioux Falls and the county. It's It's in the public news right now with the potential change merger of Multicultural Center, LSS. And I think while it's fresh in everybody's minds, I think that's a important element to look at because we want to learn from how did that county-city partnership work. The city has made a sizable investment into the Multicultural Center over the years. And so just want to make sure that a year from now, we don't forget about it. And 6 years from now, when we've got a new partnership coming up between the city and the county, we've lost all the lessons that we had when we did that program. So just to put it on our radar screen, it is something that's important to me, that we make sure we look at how that investment is and how that moves forward. It's not appropriate now this month, but looking ahead, I just want to keep it in front of us.
Great point.
One of the things that I'll be mentioning, again, in that questionnaire will be the importance of cybersecurity and keeping that in the forefront, and doing what we can as a city, along with internal audit and outside experts to make sure that, we've got all the barriers in place to help prevent cybersecurity fraud. And along those lines, I'd also recommend, I think it's September 14th, Better Business Bureau and the Chamber have that cybersecurity conference. So it would seem to make sense to me to encourage members of internal audit and maybe finance, whoever the appropriate person would be to attend.
It's a great recommendation. Noted. Anything else? All right, so we are done with that. We'll go on to our next, which is public comment. Trevor, would you like to come up and give a public comment today? All right, we'll adjourn.